Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. And I am so happy today to have Barry Spivack with me. Hello, Barry.
Hi.
And the reason I'm so happy to have Barry with me today is because he has written a book called An Antidote to Violence, something that I think we would all like to grab with both hands. So, Barry, tell us about this book and how you've come to put it together.
Well, it was a long time in the making. This was like probably my third attempt to write a book on this subject, and so it was brewing for a long time. And it took quite a while to find a publisher as well. But I practice transcendental meditation and I teach transcendental meditation, and it's sort of known for relaxation and reducing anxiety. But that peace, that inner peace that the individual gets, can also spread into the community. When there's a sufficient number of people practicing transcendental meditation, then that creates an influence of harmony in society as a whole. And there's been a lot of research showing that crime, car accidents, negative trends in society decrease. And what I want to do, a lot of the research is in obscure journals, and I wanted to make it more widely known and more to give some sort of explanation of how can it be that when people close their eyes and they're meditating, they can influence the thinking of other people who are at a distance. And I do it through the idea of collective consciousness, that we're influencing the collective consciousness. And any family, community, town, region, country has a particular flavor, a particular collective consciousness. And it's made up from all the individuals who make up that community, whether it's a family or however big it is. And so when we transcend during transcendental meditation, it's like dropping a pebble into the pond and the waves spread out and we create an influence of harmony. And that has real measurable effects. Now, there are various questions of how do you know for sure it's a meditation? This whole question of causality and correlation, but perhaps that's something we can come back to.
Tell us about collective consciousness for those who are unfamiliar with that concept.
Yeah, well, collective consciousness, it was really probably from an academic point of view, it was probably first mentioned over about 120 years or so ago, 130 years, by the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. And he talked about that every society's got a collective consciousness that binds society together, that holds society together. And his views did change, and it's slightly different from the concept that I'm using but he did say that it has a life of its own. It's this idea that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And, you know, if you go to a friend's house, it has one particular atmosphere. You go to another friend's house, has a different atmosphere. One can be very tense because they're arguing a lot, another's very harmonious. And we pick up on that mood, on that feeling. And it's the same, you say you come from Canada, so you come from Canada, you come to England. There's a different feeling. You go from England to Scotland, from France to Germany. We're very aware of the difference in the collective consciousness. You go to Switzerland and you don't drop your sweet wrapper on the floor because you just don't do it in Switzerland, and you're just automatically influenced by the collective consciousness. And when we transcend in meditation, we have a positive, harmonious influence on the collective consciousness, and negative trends begin to decrease. And you can measure these using public data such as crime, accidents, suicide rates, various different kinds of fatalities.
For those who are unfamiliar with what transcendental meditation actually is, I'm sure they've heard it, but they may not understand what it is. Can you give an outline of what it is and also how it's different from other forms of meditation?
Yeah, they're two very good questions. So take the first one first. So it's a very simple technique which allows the activity of the mind to settle down to the least excited state of human awareness. What happens is we use a thought known as a mantra, which has no meaning, it's just a sound value, and we transcend that thought, we transcend that sound, and we just experience that inner awareness. So we're awake, but there's no object of awareness. Normally, like I'm looking at you or I'm talking, people are listening, and there's some object of awareness, even if I've got my eyes closed, perhaps there's some thought or I can hear a noise, but we just transcend and there's that inner silence. And it's that experience that stimulates human growth. So people who generally meditate, for the benefits they get outside of the 20 minutes meditation morning and evening. And it doesn't require any change in lifestyle, in beliefs or diet. We just do it for 20 minutes morning and evening. Now, if you looked at somebody doing transcendental meditation and you looked at people sitting doing another kind of meditation, from the outside, they'd look exactly the same. They're sitting in a chair with their eyes closed. It looks the same. But what you can do is you can measure what's happening in the brain using an electroencephalograph. And what you find is that there are different electrical patterns that come with different kinds of meditation. And although there are many, many different kinds of meditation, we can put them into three general categories: techniques of concentration or focused attention, techniques of contemplation or open monitoring, and transcendental meditation has been called automatic self-transcending. So when you measure the electrical activity in the brain, you can get different speeds at how fast the waves are going up and down. So in a technique of concentration, because you're making an effort that's going very fast, it's called gamma, about 20 to 50 cycles per second. That's how fast the waves are going up and down. In a technique of contemplation, perhaps where you're observing the breath or just observing thoughts, it's much slower. It's more like a state of drowsiness. It's more like 4 to 8 cycles per second. So it's much slower, the waves going up and down. And so it's quite relaxing. In transcendental meditation, you get what's known as alpha 1 frequency, which is 8 to 10 cycles per second. And this is, you're rested, but you're still fully alert. So if you were to shut your eyes now, you would get alpha waves in the back of your head. What's unique about TM is you get them in the prefrontal cortex, in the front of the brain, which is we make all our values and our judgments and our decisions. And you get coherence, you get synchrony between the electrical activity on both sides of the brain, between the front and the back of the brain. And it's this coherence, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, which distinguishes transcendental meditation from other meditations. And it's like every meditation has its own value. It's not we're saying one's better than another. You know, a technique of concentration, no doubt, is good for developing the ability to concentrate. The thing with transcendental meditation is it's very holistic because it's enlivening that value of inner silence. So it has a lot of effects on many different areas like cardiovascular disease. You mentioned physical benefits before. There was one study that found over 5 years, it was a randomized trial, that people who'd learned transcendental meditation compared with those doing health education were 48% less likely to have a heart attack, stroke, or a fatality. And if they were regular meditators, that they were doing it twice a day, then they were 66% less likely to suffer one of those outcomes. So it's really very effective. And there's been a lot of research showing a wide range of benefits. But, it's a very personal thing, meditation. So people have to do what they feel comfortable with. But, transcendental meditation is what I'm familiar with. And it's, I was talking to a lady I taught recently. She had bipolar disorder. And she'd only been meditating about 3 weeks. And she just said, I just feel so happy inside. And it just came about very spontaneously. So, when you hear that feedback, it's just very satisfying. Another lady I taught recently, she teaches little kids. And she said, all the pressures of work are still there, but I don't feel so hectic. Even though it's all on the outside is the same, on the inside, it's not getting to me in the same way. So that gives you a sort of a flavor of what it's about, really.
You were talking about the fact that the mind is alert but relaxed, which is actually exactly the same with hypnosis,
Ah,
and that is one of the reasons why hypnosis is so effective in helping people deal with trauma, etc. Because when the mind is both alert and awake, it's able to make connections more easily and consequently take in new information and reshape emotions and to old incidents. So it's why it's so effective. And here we're talking about it. And what I find interesting is that it's happening in the prefrontal cortex, as you've said. So what techniques would be involved for someone to begin to develop the ability to reach this state?
yeah. That's a good question. And just before I answer that, one of the things that what you're saying about connections is that people often find when they meditate, when they transcend, it develops creativity, because creativity is all about putting things that you perhaps know, but putting them together that weren't put together before.
Exactly, and that's exactly why hypnosis is so amazing, because it's that making of connections and suddenly being able to see things differently. Uh, and as you say, it's the creative part of the brain that's being um, allowed to develop. So
What are you
it's
doing with TM is when you transcend, you develop a broader comprehension. So you see the big picture, but you don't lose that ability to focus as well. Now, coming
beautiful.
back to the other question that you asked, is transcendental meditation is an effortless technique. That's another thing I mentioned. It doesn't involve concentration or contemplation. Now, why? Why is it effortless? Because it utilizes the natural tendency of life to want to go in the direction of more and more. We all want to get more out of life, and that more can vary according to our natural tendencies and the way we are. The mind naturally wants to go in a field of greater happiness. Hopefully, people are listening to us have this conversation. But say some music might start playing in the room next door, and they might find they stop listening to us and they start listening to the music because it's more charming. The mind naturally goes in the direction of increasing charm, and these finer levels of the mind are more charming. So we don't have to make an effort. We just take an inward turn, we give the mind a direction, and the whole thing goes almost by itself. We just set the initial conditions, and then nature takes over. And that's the key thing. That's a natural process. We're not forcing anything. We're not trying to do anything. In fact, trying is the one thing that's prohibited in transcendental meditation. So
So how are you creating those conditions for the mind to naturally want to go there?
we have a technique, the technique of using the mantra in an effortless way. Because one of the mistakes people sometimes make is when they hear about transcendental meditation that you have a mantra, they assume that you concentrate on the mantra. So they assume that transcendental meditation is a technique of concentration. And nothing could be further from the truth. It's true that we use a mantra, but the way you use the mantra is very important. And we use it in a way so that we spontaneously experience finer and finer values of the mantra or sound until the mind just naturally settles down. And we don't do very much because the mind will naturally want to go in that inward direction when we give it a chance. So it's a technique of not doing. It's a technique of letting go, really. That's the whole thing. It's letting go, which I guess is also a bit like hypnosis, because some people are more susceptible to hypnosis than others, I understand, aren't they? I think. Is
Some
that,
people here to let go than others. Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. So just coming back to the mantra, are you chanting the mantra?
You think it mentally. You don't say it out loud. It's all
Okay.
mental. It's a mental technique. And it can change. It doesn't necessarily stay the same because it's becoming um, more refined, if you like, more refined. Yeah, so it's a mental technique. Um, and the key thing is how you use the mantra. And that's really what we talk. And the thing is, you know, we always want to do well when we do something new. We always want to do well at it. So I'm going to try really hard at this, whatever it is. And of course, with TM, it's the opposite. We don't want to try hard at all. I remember once, I don't know if you're familiar with this story. I can't remember if it's Alice Through the Looking Glass or Alice in Wonderland. But there's that moment when she wants to get to the Queen's garden and she keeps heading off and she keeps ending back where she started. She doesn't make any progress. And then she gets fed up. She goes off in the opposite direction and immediately ends up in the Queen's garden. And it's a bit like that with TM. If we try to get somewhere, it won't happen. As soon as we let go of trying to do anything, then it works. So it's a little bit like that.
It's a lot of the mediums who I've interviewed on this channel would say exactly the same thing. We have to get out of the way and just allow things to happen.
Exactly.
So this is a wonderful description to give people a really good idea of what transcendental meditation is. What role can it play then in creating peace?
Well, it creates peace for the individual, but right, Transcendental meditation was introduced to the West by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who passed away in 2008. But right when he started in the late 1950s, he said that even 1% of the world's population practicing transcendental meditation would have a beneficial uh, influence on society. And he was very keen all during the 60s for there to be scientific research on all aspects of TM. But it didn't start happening till the 1970s when there was a sort of an explosion of research which has continued on meditation ever since. And in 1974, an American sociologist noticed that 4 cities that had 1% of their population practicing TM, the crime was going down. So he looked into it a little bit further. He found 11 cities which all had a population between 20 to 50,000 people, where they had 1% and crime was decreasing. And then he compared those with 11 cities with a similar population, similar geographical locations, similar student population, and which were typical of crime rates for cities of that size in the USA as a whole. And there, instead of decreasing by about 8%, they were increasing by about 8%, so a 16% difference. So Maharishi got quite excited about this, and more research has been done over the years, and particularly when you have the more advanced TM programs, what's known as the TM City program, and they're practiced together in a group, it also has the same influence, but with less people. And there's been about 50 demonstrations published in about 20 peer-reviewed articles showing that when you have these numbers together, that negative trends in society, it could be war fatalities, could be car accidents, crime, infant mortality, a whole lot of negative trends begin to decrease. The big question is, how could you be sure it's the meditation? Because you get changes that happen all the time. It's like the classic example is like in the summer, more people eat ice cream and more people are murdered. But we don't say that eating ice cream results in more murders. We know it's the hot weather that's at the basis of both of those factors. It's just a correlation. So how do we know that with TM, with these improvements, it's not just a statistical correlation, it's really a cause and effect? And there are various, I mean, it's very difficult to prove in anything with sociology, cause and effect, but there are various indicators that suggest it is. One is just the sheer amount of repetition. It's just been shown so many times over and over again. So that gives a certain amount of confidence. But the other is you get unconnected variables, things like deaths from drugs, infant mortality, homicides, car accidents. They all have their own drivers for rise and falls. When they all start to move in the same direction at the same time, then that is a little bit suspicious. It suggests that there's some underlying factor that's happening that's influencing all of these at the same time. Also, there's a dosage effect. Again, when they've had a large group in America, when it's at a certain size, it will influence the US. But when it gets a little bit bigger, it gets enough to affect the indices in Canada as well, because the influence can spread. So there's a dosage effect. It's like you've got a toothache, so you take a painkiller, but you still got a toothache, so you take a second one. And so that dosage effect gives you confidence that it's really cause and effect. They've also controlled for lots of other variables like number of police on the beat, weather, all different factors that could influence these variables that they're looking at. And they haven't been able to explain what's going on. And then they also use some quite sophisticated methods of analysis known as time series analysis. That controls for inherent trends in the data. Like it's well known that murder does increase in the summer and it decreases in the winter. So it controls, time series analysis will control for those trends that are already inherent in the data to check that it's nothing to do with these seasonal variations that happen with a lot of different data. So all of that gives confidence that it is a genuine phenomenon. And of course, what the point I make in my book is that, look, don't take my word for it. Governments do your own research, as people always like to say. And the governments have got the finances and the ability, they could do it with military or with prisoners or whatever, to create a group and just see for themselves what influence it produces. And in some countries, as in South America and in India, there is starting to be more government interest in this idea. We call it the Maharishi effect because Maharishi first predicted it. In this idea that transcendental meditation can reduce negative trends in society. But the problem is, what is the mechanism? So when I'm speaking to you, perhaps a lot of your listeners, they probably don't have such a hard problem understanding how closing your eyes and meditating can create an influence on others, that they can see that everything is connected, that there's this sort of uh, universal level of life that we can influence. But for sort of like people who come from a more materialist perspective, where consciousness is seen as just an epiphenomenon of the nervous system, then this research presents a problem, because how can people sitting with their eyes closed influence others at a distance? What's the mechanism by which it works? And if you have a more expanded view of consciousness, then you can see how it works. It's like I can talk about dropping a pebble in the pond and the waves spreading out. But for a materialist, they would have a problem with that. So they would have to just say, no, the research must be flawed. There must be a mistake somewhere, because it can't possibly happen that people sitting with their eyes closed could have an influence on others at a distance. So in a way, it's this idea of the mechanism that's really the important thing. And that, Dr. Tony Nader, who's the head of the Transcendental Meditation organization, has just written a book called Consciousness is All There Is. It's coming out from Hay Press in July. And he's really going to look at this, whereas I've focused on the research, he's focusing really on the sort of theoretical background, because his point is, doesn't matter how much research you show someone, if they haven't got an understanding of the mechanism, they're not going to buy into the research. They've got to have a different sort of worldview to see how that could be.
And yet, it makes me automatically think of Rupert Sheldrake's work on morphic resonance as well. And we do know that we are energy, and there's something we have an energy field, and we can expand that energy field. So what I find is curious here is that you're not that well, maybe I should ask the question, because I'm assuming that an intention has not been set by these groups who are meditating to change the crime rate, etc. That it just happens.
That's a really good point. And it's not that intention doesn't have an effect. Intention, it's very good to have good intentions. But when you meditate, the secret of the success of TM for the individual is innocence, just complete innocence. I guess you'd probably say something similar for hypnosis, that innocence is the important factor there. So if you're being innocent, then you don't have intentions, because if you've got intentions, then you're not being completely innocent. So it does work just from contacting that field and that influence of harmony that you radiate. And so there isn't an intention to bring down crime or anything like that specifically. It is just that enlivening that field of consciousness, which spreads out. And one of the interesting things, we were talking about scientists before, I've been reading quite a bit recently, in physics, there's this idea of entanglement, because with quantum physics, they've known this for really since the beginning, early days of quantum physicists, but the general view of quantum physicists is, don't worry about what it means and what it says about our world. Just do the calculations, make the predictions, and get the technology. But a lot of people are uncomfortable with that, because there is what they call this quantum weirdness, this thing of this the particle wave split and all these sorts of duality, all these sorts of things. And this idea of entanglement is a tricky concept from a conventional point of view, but it fits very well with the idea of everything being interconnected, and probably I would imagine that a complete explanation of what's happening with the marriage effect will involve some sort of entanglement, something like that, that's taking place. But we don't really know the detailed mechanism of how it works, just in a general way of everything being connected, and that consciousness is fundamental, and that we can enliven that most fundamental level of transcendental consciousness during transcendental meditation. So that's the basic idea.
I like that we're not setting an intention, because although it's a very laudable thing to do, and I greatly value the idea of setting an intention, I also like this because it takes away the need to control. Sometimes when we're setting an intention, we can get in the way of that intention. So this is really about practicing letting go, which brings us to principles of acceptance. And and I think that's why I find this very, very interesting, because here we're just letting go. And by virtue of letting go and releasing tension, we're expanding our energy field. And and maybe it's acting like a battery of, putting positive energy into the collective consciousness, so that as we're expanding our field, maybe we're energizing that collective consciousness in a positive way.
We're making it more coherent. When you look at the one I mentioned about the EEG in the brain becomes more coherent. And that's the same thing with the society. So it's the thinking. If we look at the situations in Gaza at the moment or in Ukraine, it's the way of thinking, is that everybody from their side justifies what they're doing. They have their reasons, their historical reasons that they go into, and it justifies a particular pattern of behavior, no matter how strange that seems to people on the other side. But the thinking can change. And that's the thing, is that just like the criminal decides not to create the crime, the leaders will be influenced by the collective consciousness. And it's very spontaneous. But I wanted just to pick up on something you said before about intention, which is another point with TM that I've always really appreciated. And it can be a danger, I think, for people following a spiritual path, because we all want to do good and be better and develop. And so there's that, like you say, that tendency to push a little bit and try a little bit, and it sort of get in the way. And there can be a danger of what can be called mood making. Oh, I'm very peaceful, and this sort of, rather than just being natural. Sometimes things annoy you and you get cross. I mean, we don't want to get cross, but it happens. And the thing is, we don't want to make a pretense. We don't want to make moods. And the thing with TM is we just meditate morning and evening, and then we just get on with activity without straining too much. We just get on with our normal activity. We're not thinking, oh, I meditate, I have to be like this or anything like that. We just meditate and get on with life. And that's always appealed to me. And it does seem to resonated with what you said before, that otherwise you can be just overthinking too much. You're sort of watching yourself. And you want to be natural. The thing is to be completely natural, really. And being natural, when we're not so evolved, it's not always perhaps so ideal. But being natural is better than being unnatural. And it's a lot of it's just good manners. Just like all the things our parents taught us. That when they'll bring us up to behave nicely and things like that. And we do what we can, and the meditation helps that process. It just helps that process.
Yes, it would do, because it's lifting us out of the tension that we experience. And then it comes right back to that prefrontal cortex, doesn't it? Because what's happening there then is that we have got out of that emotional reactive state, and we are developing the ability to be more reasonable just by letting go.
Yeah. And particularly things like, often with TM, we don't prescribe how people live their lives. We just say meditate and get on with life. But the fact of meditating will mean you'll choose more activities that are good for you, and you'll choose food that's good for you. But things like drugs and things like that, they're not always so good for the prefrontal cortex. And when people are sent to prison, that's also not so good for the brain. It doesn't help people to become better people when they go to prison. And so we want to have activities, diet, exercise, all the things that we're told about good diet and regular exercise, good sleep, because all these things have a good effect on the physiology, and mind and body are intimately connected. But rather than being in a vicious cycle, when you meditate, it starts to put you into more virtuous cycles. So as you start to make better choices, and just things get better.
And that, I think, comes back to what you said about cohesion in the brain, because it means that those feelings that we experience that are so chaotic are beginning to perhaps not dissipate in that sense of the word, but I think that if we're feeling calmer, then we're able to process the unconscious feelings that are generating the behavior, because emotion drives behavior. And if we can be calmer within ourselves, then that, I think, is what's there's a it, it's calming the emotional state, which means that we're able to make better choices. So it makes sense what you're saying, because we're able we to regulate our feelings better, not without suppressing them.
And there was a word you said before actually about not being so reactive. And that's one I hear a lot when I teach people, where they say they're not so reactive. Like they've got more time and space. That's what I was saying about the broader comprehension. You don't sort of jump in with both feet. And there are different words you can use to describe it. You talk about calmness, but there's a growth of silence within. And it's just like having more space and time is a good way, because people often just struggle, like, should I use more control, more measured? And they're not quite happy with those words, like you said, regulate, because it sounds like you're trying to do something, where actually it's more spontaneous. You're not trying to be measured, you're not trying to be controlled. It just happens that it's like that, this woman who said to me that life wasn't so hectic. The pressures were still there, but her reaction to it was completely different. It's just that growth of silence from inside that which makes you less reactive. Yeah, less reactive. And it's interesting, when you see great, I don't know if you like sport, but if you watch great sportsmen, the really top ones, they always seem to have more time than the ones who aren't so at the same level. Yeah, it's just like things slow down for them because it's that, they've got more sense of what's going on, that broader comprehension. And because everything's happening, in fast sports at really top speed, but it's just that sort of having more time, and it's the same, obviously, different sort of context, but it's the same with us in our interpersonal relationships, that we're not jumping in with both feet. There's just that a little bit more space and time. And it, particularly people notice it with their kids, because kids can really wind you up sometimes. And people find they don't snap quite so much, or with their, people you're living with, because, unfortunately, we tend to snap at our nearest and dearest, those we're living with. And you just find that it was funny, this lady I taught, actually, her husband had learnt that 6 months ago, and she was very skeptical. She really thought he was wasting his time. And I thought, well, have you noticed any difference? And she said, he's all happier, he's less stressed, and he listens to me when I talk. And yeah, it's just that, that
I think
silence, that growth of silence.
I think, some people might be concerned that it means that they're suddenly going to become so chilled that nothing gets, or so chilled that, they're targets for abuse. And that's not what we're saying. Actually, it's the opposite. What we're saying is you will be stronger and you will have your boundaries naturally there, uh, much more much more so than if you are feeling harried and stressed and you're being driven by emotions that have their root in trauma. So this actually will help you to be stronger and ultimately then help the world improve.
People are more able to set boundaries because, often we can all have a tendency to be people pleasers, because it's nice, you don't, it's a natural thing to want to do, really. But sometimes you have to say no, and people do find it's more easy to say no when they've been meditating, that you can just create your own boundaries and not be so put upon. Um, but, because we want to say no in a nice way, and often it feels, because we don't want to hurt other people, and so we sort of don't do what we feel we should do. But it's just exactly as you described. It's that ability to, because what you're developing is an interesting point. I talked about the growth of silence, which is that unboundedness, but it's unboundedness within boundaries, because life has both aspects. We have to live life through routine. We get up, we get dressed, we eat, we go to sleep, we do all these things day in, day out, the same things, regular routine. Yet what we want is that ability of transcendence. Everyone wants to, climb the mountain, to to let go in some way. And they might have different ways of doing it, different hobbies. So there's those two seemingly opposed tendencies in life, that living life through boundaries and that desire for unboundedness. And that's what's developed with the development of higher states of consciousness, which comes from regular practice of TM, that living the unboundedness in the boundaries, really.
Well, I hope that our discussion is helping everyone to see why transcendental meditation would be an antidote to violence, which in fact is the title of the book that we are discussing. Barry, thank you so much for your time today.
Yours
Ah,
is.
beautiful. Thank you so much for agreeing to this interview.
No, I've really enjoyed it. It's been lovely meeting you.
If people want to find out more about your work, Barry, how do they do that?
Well, if they go on Amazon and Google Barry Spivack, the books will come up. If they want to know more about transcendental meditation, just there's a uk.tm.org website where it's all there. Tell them more about transcendental meditation.
Okay. Thank you so very much. And thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be talking about paranormal phenomena. Until then, goodbye.